One.
Hello and welcome everybody to this week's edition of Truth to Power. My name is Justin Mogg. I'm one of the programmers here on Forward Radio. Joining me in the virtual studio is Hart Hagan again. Welcome, Hart.
Hi, Justin. How are you?
Great. Hart is a host of Let's Talk and the Climate Report. You can hear it every day of the week here at 7 p.m. on 106.5 FM. We're still broadcasting from the top of the Hagan building, even in the midst of a pandemic, and we live stream to the world at forwardradio.org. And take a minute if you're enjoying what you're hearing, and I bet you won't hear talk like you're going to hear on this program anywhere else on the radio dial. We'll honor that with maybe a little contribution today, help keep us on the air. It only takes $20 a day. And what a great treasure we've got here in Forward Radio. And if you want to keep it strong, you can support it today. So what we're going to talk about today is organized labor. I'm really excited to jump into this topic at this really important time in the midst of the pandemic, when we're all seeing who the truly essential workers are, right? And it's really revealing to us the importance of getting organized again as workers. And so that's what we're going to focus on today with three great guests from DSA Louisville, the Democratic Socialists of America. You can learn more about the organization at dsalouisville.org. They're also on social media and all that. You can find those links at dsalouisville.org. But with us in the virtual studio are Katie Punsley. Hey, Katie.
Hey, how's it going?
Great to see you today. Jo Smiley's here as well. Hi, Jo.
Hello.
And we also have Nick Conder. Hi, Nick.
Hi, everybody.
So just so everybody knows, these look like some fairly younger people, which, you know, the DSA Louisville demographic tends to swing a little young, but I love what's going on with the resurgence of socialism in America, and I'm, you know, over 40, so hey, we can all get in on this, right? But let's talk about why this issue of organized labor is so important to you all, especially as young people who maybe are just entering the workforce. Talk a little bit about why you think organized labor is such an important issue at this time.
So I've been part of my union, since the first day I signed up. That was before I think right to work was passed in Kentucky. And, I didn't fully understand why it was so important as a teacher to be part of the union until I think it was 2016 or 2017. Our district was trying to keep us from getting our salary steps. So every year we're supposed to get a small salary increase, and the longer you go on, the more significant that is. And they were hoping to freeze all of them.
Wow.
This was under the former superintendent, Donna Hagan. And so I was fully expecting that we were going to come out the other side, of the situation for the worse. And our union managed to negotiate not only a protection for those salary steps, but also I think it was an over 2% increase, raise with inflation. So that sort of gave me the first look into how, powerful we are to have a bargaining unit as one of the only teacher unions in the state, to be able to negotiate in that form. And so, that was really just an impressive display.
Yeah. Jo, how about you? What are your thoughts on this, just to get us started?
Yeah, so my first foray, I guess you could say, into labor organizing was actually at a university. I was involved in helping organize a union for graduate employees, graduate workers at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri. And we did that because kind of at the 11th hour, the university decided they were going to stop providing healthcare to graduate workers. So the union drive was one of the most uplifting things I'd ever experienced. I met so many great people through it that, we all came together and all kind of collectively said, that's not okay. You can't exploit graduate labor. We actually do quite a lot to keep the university running. And we organized a union. We ended up affiliating with the NEA, and now I'm a library clerk at the Louisville Free Public Library, and I'm unionized through AFSCME, and it's been equally rewarding at every step of the way.
Wow. Wow.
And when I was a grad student teacher, I would have really loved to have those
I know.
protections.
I know, right? Well, how about you, Nick? What's your history with organized labor?
So, I actually grew up in a family. I was raised, a lot by my grandparents who had been union members in the bakery union. It's a long acronym: bakers, confectioners, tobacco workers, and grain millers. But, they kind of stressed to me from a very young age that, anything that we had, like my grandfather's pension or their health care, or really even the fact that he was able to keep his job for, or over the course of two workplaces, two jobs over the course of 30 years and then retire without, being fired at will, basically. That was all thanks to the union. And so, I grew up, went into the workforce. I worked in retail. I was a graduate student worker for several years, and I'd never worked in a union workplace. And, there were a lot of times where I was like, man, I could really use a union right now. Eventually I got to the point where once I was finished with graduate school, I went and worked in the library as well. And so I'm also a library clerk with the local free public library. And, it's great to have a union, especially in a time like this, because, the idea that just me as one person out of 300 employees of the library could say, okay, I have this problem and I need it addressed. I don't think I would get anything done. I've worked in workplaces where it's easy to ignore you, but the union, it speaks with a collective voice. And so we had extremely good sick leave benefits during all this that applied to a number of different categories of workers. Not just people who had coronavirus, but people who were at risk from it. There were a lot of concerns about safety, and instead of voicing those, on a one-to-one basis with our supervisors, it's good to have a union who can say, speak up and say what anyone would like to say in a workplace. And I think on a basic level, that's true of anywhere. When you look at grocery workers or healthcare workers, or anyone, we're all fighting a lot of the same fights right now.
And Hart, what about you? Did you come from a union family or anything like that? What's your background in this?
None of that. I just got to the point where I saw our planet kind of melting away and started getting interested in some alternative viewpoint other than what I'd been force-fed my entire life through media, so I'm kind of a good indicator of what does John Q. Public think or Jane Q. Public think. And one thing that this attitude that I had up until I became progressive like 2 years ago, became an environmentalist again about 4 years ago. And one thing that I thought prior to that, just kind of indoctrinated, is that like unions are a kind of a drag on the economy. It's like if you, but what I never considered, I never understood how harmful concentrated capital was, but also I never considered that corporations are collective bargaining for capital. Why shouldn't workers be able to collectively bargain? So we have this twisted, indoctrinated system where it's bad for the economy to collectively bargain as workers, and we don't understand that Walmart is collective bargaining for capital. And it's always an uneven playing field. And I remember it was somebody like Bakunin, or not him, but somebody who said, the capital can always wait for somebody else to come along, but the worker needs a job now. So there's always an unequal playing field between the two. And besides that, over the course of time, people of wealth have their share of the income has increased. In the last 50 years, their share of income has increased, whereas workers, their share of the income has stayed kind of flat. So it's not working out in a way that's equitable at all.
And leveling that playing field has always been a central tenet of DSA, right? Does anyone want to talk about DSA's sort of vision and mission?
Sure, I can do that. Well, DSA, as I think you already know, is the nation's largest socialist organization. And I think as a socialist organization, we believe in working class power, building working class power. And we fight for things like stronger unions, but also, Medicare for all, a living wage, all of these types of protections that can strengthen and empower the working class. I think at the core of it, I would say that DSA believes capitalism is causing terrible trauma and mass death on a planet-wide scale, and that an empowered, united working class is the best way to fight against that.
So it's about, is it about balancing the scales, or is it about totally upsetting the apple cart altogether and starting something new? Where do you all sit on that sort of line?
Both. It's not an either or.
I think it's sort of a first one, then the other. Yeah. I would say that historically you could argue that workers actually gain power through sort of what we would call, kind of social democratic reforms, right? Whenever workers have healthcare, whenever they have strong unions, whenever they, have education and sick leave and all of these things, they are stronger as a class, and then they can fight for more and they can demand more. And, I think a lot of us, I'm sure not everyone would agree with this, but I think most people in the DSA would imagine that developing that sort of baseline to further class struggle is a good first step. And then from there, you can fight to actually, talk about the transition of the capitalist state into, what does a workers' state look like? What does an economy where workers manage and own their workplaces look like, instead of a very small capitalist class owning everything and the rest of us kind of working for whatever they'll give us, and that involves kind of a lot of organizing, both through labor, but also through, electoral fights, or just really even movement fights, right? Getting out in the street and protesting and holding rallies and everything else. And eventually, I think most DSA members would say that we would, like to see workplaces where you don't have a management on behalf of capital. You have democracy. The workers who are controlling the workplace and putting in their labor to create all this wealth are the ones that get to determine, what are our wages, what are our conditions, what are we even going to make. Imagine if workers could vote at a factory to shut down production of something unimportant like a dishwasher or a car and start manufacturing ventilators right now. That would be a dramatically different and probably better society than what we live in.
And of course,
you don't mean actual democracy, do you?
I'm talking about democracy.
That's a dangerous idea. That's subversive.
I'm talking about the kind of democracy that Americans have never experienced.
Wow, ever really?
What he said.
But there are examples of democratic workplaces in America, right? There are employee-owned companies, there are cooperatives.
Yeah.
Talk about how that fits in with sort of our existing capitalist model.
So I guess this is fun for me, because a lot of my graduate student research was specifically on cooperatives. But yeah, there are workplaces where they have complete ownership by the actual workers who are employed by the firm. And whenever profit sharing comes around, it doesn't go to stockholders who are sitting in a boardroom somewhere or by the fireplace smoking a pipe or whatever. It goes to the people whose blood, sweat, and tears went into the building of that company in the first place. And you see examples where profits are used to not just provide direct payments to workers, but to improve communities, to build homes for people that work in neighborhoods, and it allows people to sort of model a democracy, which in a lot of cases transforms them. And this is very similar to what people in unions sort of experience through, class struggle, basically, that having an experience where you are recognized as a worker and you are recognized as someone with power because you're a worker, that dramatically changes your outlook on a day-to-day basis.
One thing that's needed in order to get to democracy at work, more and more collectively owned enterprise. Yeah, legally it's possible now, but one thing that we need to get to that is what is called a right of first refusal, where if a company is going to go out of business or sell, then they should give the employees the first right to buy those assets or buy that company on favorable financing terms. So there needs to be public policy to encourage workplace, democracy at work and cooperatively owned enterprises.
Yeah, because right now it's generally like a corporate takeover and strip the company for parts, right?
Right.
Instead of really supporting the workers or the communities that they live in. Anybody want to talk about some recent developments that are exciting maybe in this COVID-19 pandemic? Like, I'm always looking for the silver linings in this crazy times. It seems like people are getting organized as workers, right?
Can anybody talk about Chris Small of Amazon?
No, tell us about that.
Well, he's a guy who organized some of his work. He was fired from Amazon I think he was in New Jersey, possibly. He was fired for organizing. He felt that the conditions in his workplace were unsafe, and when he tried to organize he was educating people about the conditions, and Amazon fired him under false pretenses, but he was interviewed a couple of times on some national shows. And anyway, I just thought I'd throw out the name.
Yeah, I'm sorry to disappoint Justin, but our thinking's been that I think a lot of us are really optimistic making the movement to, we're doing remote, working full time now. And so when I first started, I was like, this is going to be amazing. You'll be able to work from home. You can set your own hours, have flexibility, meet students where they are. But, one of the things that I think I didn't anticipate and a lot of other teachers didn't anticipate was that we have a very robust contract that we fought for really hard, and those outline very specifically what administrators can and can't do. And when the pandemic hit, all of that stuff went out the window. All these new scenarios that were not delineated in any way, started to come up, and administrators would use that as an opportunity to push workers harder. You see teachers working longer hours. You see them being asked for things outside their job responsibility, outside of things that were normally protected by our contract. And since we're right in the middle of our, our contract renewal won't be up until I think 2023. So it's some time before we get to renegotiate that. And so we've done some memorandum of understandings and those kinds of things to kind of bridge the gap. But it's unfortunate that the leeway isn't working in the employee's favor, right? That it's not an opportunity for us to be more autonomous. And so those are the kinds of conversations we're having. So I guess the silver lining is that we are, forming employee resource groups, and we are, forming caucuses and subcommittees to kind of think about, well, what can we do if this becomes a long-term thing and we're not just in survival mode trying to build the plane as we fly, and how can we make education better in the fall if we continue into the next school year for however long we need to ride this out.
What about outside of Louisville? Are there any national stories that have been piquing your all's interest in this pandemic related to labor?
Yeah, I could take this opportunity to talk about a joint project DSA has been working on with UE, the United Electrical Workers, on the national level. that both of them created the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, which is helping workers who've been deemed essential organize in their workplaces to get protections that can help keep them safe during the COVID-19 pandemic. When I heard about that, I just immediately thought, oh, this is great. This is perfect. Like, this is one of those stories that makes me think, yeah, you know, people can come together when it's needed and do collective action and get some stuff done.
What's why should people care about union? If you're not that union worker in the union benefiting from that collective bargaining, how does it benefit society as a whole?
I mean, I think that when workers have protections, everyone benefits. I think, for example, like take the example of food service. A food service employee who's a minimum wage worker who doesn't have paid sick leave. You know, if that person has to come to work sick, that impacts the whole community because they're making food and they could infect anyone at their job or anyone that goes, you know, and eats at that restaurant. If that worker has protections, though, that worker can stay home when they're sick, can get medical care, can take care of themselves. And then not only they benefit, but also everyone that works with them benefits, and also everyone that frequents, you know, that restaurant benefits. You know, it's a ripple effect.
We're talking about organized labor here today on Truth to Power with me, Justin Mogg, co-hosting with Hart Hagan as well. And we're speaking with three folks from DSA Louisville. You just heard from Jo Smiley, but we're also on the line with Katie Punsley and Nick Conder, talking about the labor movement in these times. I guess there's been, I mean, we should talk about sort of the, I don't know, we talk about flattening curves all the time. It feels like the labor curve has been flattened in terms of like the organized labor's power in America in recent decades. Who wants to reflect on that and what they see going forward?
You know, I think whenever you look back at, say, the 1950s, when, you know, I want to say it was closer to a third of American workers were in unionized workplaces. Workers were able to fight for and demand things that we take for granted now. You know, workers did not have to, I guess, just, you know, take it whenever their company decided to, you know, cut pay or cut positions or things like that. You know, people actually, you know, they went on strike and they fought. And, you know, there's a lot of debate on the left as to whether the declining radicalism of unions led to the declining influence of unions or vice versa. It's sort of a chicken or the egg situation, probably. I think they probably both had to do with one another. But yeah, I mean, there was a long period of time where not only were fewer and fewer workers in unions, the unions that we did have in this country were doing less and less action. And it's really only in the last few years where the idea of having large strikes has even come back into the popular imagination. I mean, if you think about the entire period of time between the UPS strike, and I believe it was 1997, and the teachers' strikes in 2016, 17, and so on. You know, that period of time, that was almost 20 years there. The number of workers on strike, you can go through and look at the chart. It was incredibly low. And then in just the past 4 years, it's shot back up. And a lot of that did specifically have to do with the teachers. And I'm sure Katie has a lot more to say about that than I do. But I mean, you saw GM workers go on strike last year. We saw AT&T workers go on strike here in Louisville and across the South. And, you know, in this pandemic moment, you're seeing, you know, more unorganized actions, but you're seeing even non-union workers go on
Yeah.
strike, right? There were, Amazon workers walking out. And I think that's a glimmer of hope for unions, because if you look at the early history of organized labor in this country, the way unions were built and formed, especially like the Knights of Labor in the 1880s, was not because the unions were calling strikes. It was that workers would get fed up and then they'd go on strike. And then once they were out, not working, they're like, well, I guess we better join the union. And so I think there's a potential for a lot of that now, because if you're a worker at Amazon, or to cite some of the emergency workplace organizing committee stuff that Joe talked about, they're workers at Jimmy John's or Taco Bell in various places that have taken workplace action. Well, now they've got like a little website and a Twitter account that says Taco Bell Workers United or whatever. That's more than they had before. It might not be legally a union, but it's certainly something, and it could become a union because now they're organized. And there's great potential for that all over this country right now.
Right. I'm thinking about, to me, capital is always plotting and scheming to advance its interest and to aggrandize its wealth. Yeah, NAFTA it had no small impact on unions. You have the Taft-Hartley Act back in the 50s had certain restrictions that I don't really understand, but you can't have solidarity strike. You can't strike just because you're in solidarity with this other group over here. There's been less and less consumer type of, like, as a consumer or as a citizen, I might look for the union label, and whether or not there is a union label is a function of these trade deals and the control of capital to restrict the amount of information that people actually have. And then you have National Labor Relations Board that, there are pro-union laws in place that are not enforced, that haven't been enforced since the Reagan era or whatever. And so you have capital bending government to its will, and then government either doing or not doing things that disadvantage unions. And so, one question I have is like, what's your wish list? What would you like to see from a legal standpoint or from a standpoint of solidarity and organizing? What's the best case scenario? What would you like to see happen?
Well, I've been working with one of the labor notes organizers a bit on, they drafted a 5-point proposal for teachers and, what our COVID-19 demands would be, and a lot of the things, I think, it's a strange time because as Nick was saying, our power really was in those teacher strikes, and the question is, how do you take collective action when everyone has moved online? And so that's part of what some of the discussions are, how we can withhold labor, how we can, make our collective voices heard. But I think a lot of teachers agree that, a lot of the mandates that were going on in a normal school year, like standardized testing, those kinds of things don't make sense, in this new world, that we're trying to build a sense of teacher solidarity, that we're trying to prevent austerity from happening, changes to our benefits, changes to our pension, which is they've already tried to do that, in our legislature here in the short amount of time before they closed, for the session, right? So those are just a few of the things that teachers in particular, I think, are worried about.
How would you reflect, Katie, on the relative success of those teacher strikes we saw? Obviously, the project isn't finished, but do you feel like you could define them as successful?
It's complicated,
Yeah.
And like I'm in union leadership, so I have I think a very nuanced perspective about those issues. As you know, they were wildcat strikes and they weren't supported by the union. But there's, as Hart was saying, there's a whole bunch of structural reasons that it's hard for a union to strike, right? It's illegal. They can't really say the word. And so what sort of happened in that whole process was We saw a lot of grassroots organizing. We saw organizing of teachers like we've never seen across the state. And so in addition to the union apparatus and the association apparatus that we had, we were starting to build pockets of just like rank and file members who were really riled up and were really ready to fight on these issues. And I think having that infrastructure and seeing all of these colleagues step up to be comrades was just really amazing. And it's, I always worry that when we get a more sympathetic like governor like Bashir, that people are like, okay, the fight's over, like
Right.
we're good. And we fought really hard to get in there. And I think everyone's breathing a sigh of relief that we did. But that doesn't mean the fight's over. That doesn't mean there aren't still a lot of things that we want to see improved.
Yeah, especially nationally. But my goodness, there's still a lot of work to do. Well, I don't know if y'all how steeped y'all are in labor history, but if anybody could school me, I'd love to hear some of your reflections on maybe some of your heroes in the labor movement, or some of the moments in American labor history that you really want to lift up in this moment.
I like how Eugene V. Debs got like 1 million votes or something for president while he was in jail. Like he ran for president. He ran for president 5 times, and one time he had been put in prison for exercising his free speech rights under Woodrow Wilson. And when he was still in prison, he ran for president, got a lot of votes, and so that is. And he was primarily a union leader, very eloquent. And it's no coincidence that he's been pretty much erased from history, because Orwell said, who controls the past controls the future. With the fact that we hardly know who Eugene V. Debs is, and
Right.
he had a lot of influence, in my understanding, on FDR. And people think that third parties split the vote. Well, third parties can drag you back to where you should have been all along. And that's what Eugene V. Debs did.
In a similar vein, I've always wanted to teach, like every time, we do lessons on Martin Luther King, I've always wanted to teach about Bayard Rustin, who I also think was someone who is really erased from history. It's a little bit tricky in public schools, especially because we do have, a diverse group of students. We have Christian students and Muslim students for whom, it's hard to talk about gay rights, and it's the sort of thing that can make people really uncomfortable when a public school teacher brings it up. But it's one of the reasons that he was erased, and I think the fact that they used that to silence him is really telling of the fact that there really was this intersectional movement in civil rights history and in labor history, but we just don't hear about it, right? That stuff has kind of been brushed under the rug.
I think one example that comes to mind to me, which is and a lot of labor history, I think, is erased from I guess the popular conception of history. You don't learn about this stuff in school. But during the Great Depression, there was a great upsurge in organized labor activity for a couple of reasons. But one of the sort of stories, I guess, the Democratic Party likes to tell is that FDR got elected and did all these wonderful things and freed up unions and things like that. But they sort of got backwards, right? What happened was a lot of workers were pissed off. I don't know if I can say that on the radio, but
you're my guest.
And they were very angry, and they began organizing even where union infrastructure was relatively weak, and won significant victories. The modern Teamsters Union, which is a gigantic union now, and there are divides within it and everything else, but the way they built their power and even built their membership initiated out of a strike in Minneapolis in 1934, where actually a small group of Trotskyites helped initiate a strike among Teamsters truck drivers in the city, and it ended up growing into a 3-month long general strike that resulted in actual armed clashes between soldiers and workers. And there was a governor at the time who'd been elected as sort of a social democratic farmer labor politician. And everyone was thinking, okay, well, he's going to be very sympathetic to the strikers. And of course, he called out, soldiers to shoot at him. And so the workers, of course, organized very deeply in a way that hadn't really been seen before. And by the time it was over, they had built something so powerful that they could defeat not just the boss, but, essentially the power of the state. And from there, the next 20 or 30 years, the Teamsters grew from a relatively disorganized union into one of the strongest forces in the American workplace. There are several books by a man named Farrell Dobbs who details this. Will never be assigned in any school classroom, but certainly I would encourage people to read more about that, because he goes very in depth into just the very intricate history on almost the day-to-day building of before a strike, and then what happens as the strike goes along, and then also kind of analyzes what happened to the Teamsters afterwards. I think it's important for anyone to go back and draw on any of that history they can, because history maybe doesn't necessarily repeat, but there are a lot of overlap between different eras. And I think as we're approaching what may or may not be a depression economically, which none of us have lived through before, might be a good time to start reading about what workers were doing in the 30s.
I would recommend Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. It's like you'll never see the United States the same way.
It's a great
book. Yeah. And it's like the history that we get is like hero worship. Lincoln, Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, FDR, all the politicians. It's designed to justify the system and justify concentrations of power. And if you like, Lincoln is just about the only president I still like. But Lincoln was brilliant, but he's kind of overrated. His story is told in a way as to like he's the reason slaves were free. If we just give the system enough time, the system will work. Whereas Howard Zinn comes in and tells you, like within the first few pages, the real story of Lincoln, or of Columbus. He was a pirate, and he goes, he goes through, he tells you a side of Helen Keller you never saw before, and just on and on. But we need a perspective on history that does not just justify the system.
Well, I wonder too about some of the connections between this desire for more organized workers and that sort of movement building versus the nature of what we think of as a traditional political party and electoral politics. We saw a lot of interest in democratic socialism around the Bernie Sanders campaign, but is it happening? Is it a part of electoral politics, or is that not really the DSA's main focus or attention right now?
So the DSA does work with electoral politics, but that's one of many projects that we do. In Louisville specifically, we have electoral projects. We also have a labor committee, and we're working on all kinds of things. Historically, the labor movement has this has been brought up before on this interview, has done electoral politics, what with getting Eugene Debs something like 1 million votes while he was in prison, running as a socialist candidate for president for the First World War, or near the First World War era. I think electoral politics is important, but shouldn't be the only thing that we do. I think, yeah. Go ahead, Katie. Sorry.
Oh no, go. Do you want to finish?
I was going to say, I think that electoral politics is important if it's got class struggle behind it. One of the things we talk about in DSA is this idea of class struggle elections, where we support, candidates for local office or for higher office, Bernie Sanders being an example, candidates who are going to actually try and enact policies that are going to help the working class. So in that sense, yeah, electoral politics is something that we should still be doing, but it shouldn't be the only thing we do. We should also be working on strengthening the labor movement, getting workers more protections, like on the job now, not waiting for somebody to put something through Congress.
One thing I've gathered in DSA is like training on how to build unions that are more democratic in nature rather than, really worker-controlled, worker-driven unions. Am I on the right track with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell me more.
So there's something we call the rank and file strategy that a lot of us are really invested in. And basically the concept behind this is that, when we talk about the Socialist Party in, the early 1900s, being largely powered by, workers and labor unions, what we actually saw really after the 30s and then going into especially the Red Scare in the 1950s, a couple of things happened. One is that, the socialist movement splintered, right? You had the Socialist Party, but then you had the Communist Party, and then the Communist Party splintered into the Communists and the Trotskyists, and then the Trotskyites splintered into 1,000 parties. And, you saw that happen, and the socialist movement was weakened. But then also the labor movement sort of made a deal with the devil, right? They essentially expelled the socialists and the communists from labor unions in the late 40s and cozied up to the Democratic Party. And, this had started really in the 30s with FDR, but it formed this transactional partnership. And as that's gone along, a lot of unions have become more compliant with not just, a capitalist party, but also with the capitalist system. There are several labor leaders that wrote an op-ed a few weeks ago praising capitalism of all things, which, Eugene Debs is rolling over so hard in his grave that you can hear it from here. Like, this idea came where, labor and capital could work hand in hand. I think that has a lot to do with sort of the passive non-resistance to the weakening of the working class in this country. And so our idea is, when we talk about the rank and file strategy is, socialists have become separated from the working class. You come to a lot of socialist meetings sometimes, and you are just as likely to see someone who is making $100,000 a year as you are someone who's in a union. And that's not exactly what you would like to see when you go to a socialist meeting. And so a lot of people have taken it upon themselves to, work with worker leaders. Sometimes specifically people go into workplaces in the rank and file. Right now, you're not just going to get hired as an organizer working for the leadership of the union and transform it, right? You work for the leadership of the union, but your union does have elections, right? They elect the leadership of the union from inside the workplace, and it's very important for I think socialists to go in, and it's not an explicitly political thing. It's not just about the number of socialists in the workplace that you have. It's about identifying leaders within a workplace who are who only really just needed to be mobilized and organized for sometimes the first times in their life. And you'll find people in unions who are extremely conservative who then emerge as militant leaders in a strike or something like that, and that might sound ridiculous to someone listening to this, but it's something that happens again and again. And so identifying those types of leaders and helping them realize their own power and talk to their coworkers and organize even when the union itself is not ready to go along for more militant resistance to the boss, that can transform a workplace. It can transform a union. I would point to a lot of the victories that teachers unions have had in recent years. It's directly tied to reform movements and a lot of teachers unions, right? You look at the Chicago Teachers Union, for example, which has fought and won 2 strikes in the last decade. And the way they did that was that, a caucus of educators formed and won control of the union. And now you have, thousands of teachers who are organized, willing to fight back against 2 different mayors and sort of, break their power in a lot of ways. And then go on and pioneer ideas like social justice unionism, right? Where you have people concerned not just about the contract and how much they're getting paid and all that, but they're concerned about how many nurses are in the schools and affordable housing and all these other things, because really workplace issues and societal issues are not separate. And I think obviously it becomes very evident, I think, when you're a teacher, because any issues that are happening in your community come into the school and vice versa. But that's something that leverages power workers in a way that has not been seen in a lot of the labor movement for the last few decades. And I think most socialists would like to see sort of a turn back towards that style of organizing.
Yeah. I definitely want to ask about the ripple effects, the societal ripple effects of organized labor. But let me quickly remind everyone that you're listening to Truth to Power here on Forward Radio. We're having a community conversation about organized labor with me, Justin Mogg, and co-host Hart, Hagan. And we're talking with 3 folks from DSA Louisville: Nick Conder, Jo Smiley, and Katie Punsley. You can learn more about the group at dsalouisville.org. Katie, I think you wanted to say something, especially about when we were talking about electoral politics.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to speak to Nick's point about how we do have a really broad coalition that has, I think, a much wider range of political views than one might expect. And, some of our most vocal supporters of public education are lifelong Republicans, and they're even running for office to challenge incumbents that they feel like haven't been doing, the best that they can do for teachers. And so even though they might have different views on a variety of other issues, because they are part of the same, working class with the same class interests, at least, as far as I understand through things like public education, they can really come together and make a lot of change in that regard. And we see, we've seen a lot of teachers finding their voice in that sort of electoral arena in recent years. I think in our last big election cycle, we had like 40 teachers in Kentucky running for office. Wow. Which was a new record. And I'd be remiss not to mention Robert Bell, who's currently running for Metro Council District 4. And he's one of the people that DSA is really proud to have running for office.
And he's one of 3 teachers just running for that one seat. So your point is absolutely right. The teachers are really getting involved.
I have a couple of questions about DSA. One thing that I noticed early on is that there is a socialist night school. And how does that come about? What have you been talking about lately? And then another thing is the Solidarity City. I think Joe referenced that. What is Solidarity City? And go from there.
Okay, so Solidarity City is one of our committees, one of our groups that we organize to help actually get the work done on the ground. And the idea behind that one in particular is we're trying to organize for a working class response to the COVID pandemic right now. But we're also just trying to organize for a more compassionate city, a Louisville that cares about its people, regardless of what their background is or who they are.
Yeah, I think, the Solidarity City Committee is in a lot of ways intricately tied to our electoral work, but also tied to our non-electoral work, right? We have organizing resources for tenants. Obviously, we've uh, issued demands around COVID-19 response. It grew out of a fight around the city budget last year, which who knows what's happening with that now, but it even stretches back into like the Fenwick for Mayor campaign in 2018. We had endorsed Ryan Fenwick when he ran for mayor, and again now he's running for Metro Council. And I think that's sort of been the public-facing expression that so far this year are those two Metro Council campaigns, because it does kind of tie back into that concept of class struggle elections that Joe talked about. Is that you don't just run elections to win, right? In fact, whether or not you win an election is only one part of assessing success, right? One of the other reasons is that you run an election to wage class struggle, essentially. And for socialist organizations, and I think for especially DSA, these campaigns are really only one of the very few ways that we can get out and talk to regular people, at their doors on a day-to-day basis about issues like, how much the city spends on various public services, or how much the city gives away to luxury hotels, or how the city treats homeless people, or how real estate developers are flipping houses and making half the city unaffordable for people who used to live in neighborhoods. Those are issues that people care about deeply, and there's just not a lot. There are not a lot of outlets to actually talk with people and organize people. And so the trick is to use electoral campaigns to do that, to build your movement, so that win or lose, at the end of it, you still got your movement. And I think that is the success of the Bernie campaigns, both in 2016 and 2020. It's no coincidence that DSA went from a group of 5,000 members to 65,000 members during that time. Hopefully on the other end of this, obviously I think we have a very strong chance to win both of these elections coming up on June 23rd. But even if we didn't, we've still got all these people who went and knocked on doors and made phone calls and really put a little bit of them on the line to fight for these issues that they care about. And those people do not have to go away. We have this idea in this country where elections happen once every 4 years, and then you go and complain and go to brunch or whatever and not do anything. That is a completely backwards view of politics. Politics happens not just in the ballot box; it's everything that happens between the elections as well. And I think if we use these opportunities to build a movement that can organize, every day on every street in every city in America, then I think eventually you're going to build a movement that's too powerful to stop.
Well, isn't the Democratic Party all about class struggle? I mean, what's left to be done?
I love how Hart drops those one-liners. It's kind of like dropping the mic. We're nearing the end of our time together, but I do want to circle back to this question about what do you all see as the potential positive ripple effects of a strong labor movement on things like protecting the environment, on things like racial justice, women's rights. Connect the dots for folks.
Yeah, I really think that strong labor movements give marginalized groups a strength in numbers, right? A lot of the time, if you are part of a minority group, it's hard to build any kind of power. You could be, just constantly steamrolled without an real opportunity to fight back. And I think, having strong unions helps protect those people. It also, I think, as Hart's been alluding to, this whole time, it gives us an idea of who the real enemy is, right? A lot of the time you'll hear politicians blaming other poor people, blaming immigrants and refugees for our problems, but we know that the other poor people are not the reason that we're poor. It's bosses who have exploited workers, who are making, obscene profits off the back of their employees. So it really, I think, sharpens our thinking and understanding of the kind of solidarity that we need among all of these movements that might seem really disparate.
If you want to know who's picking your pocket, look up, not down.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in terms of environmental justice, Katie talked about marginalized groups of people. But in terms of environmental justice, like the labor movement, when the labor movement fights for better protections on the job, those also often include safety regulations that could, for example, prevent mega corporations from dumping pollutants into the rivers, for example. So this would obviously provide a positive ripple effect on environmental justice, because all of those regulations keep corporations from cutting corners and hurting our planet. And as they say, all those regulations are written in blood.
Yeah, and I'd say historically there's been a bit of a divide between the environmental movement and the labor movement in this country. Really over, I think from a labor perspective, there's a reasonable concern, right? Okay, if we're gonna, not have a coal industry anymore, what are you gonna do for all the people who don't have jobs anymore, right? Because, it doesn't matter what the ideology of the person that goes into the coal mine is. They're doing it because they need the money, just like any of the rest of us. And so if you come along and say, okay, we're not going to do that anymore, and by the way, you're not going to have a job, and we don't have any plan for what to do with you once that job disappears, of course no one's going to support getting rid of the coal industry, right? And so I think the concept of the Green New Deal, which has originated in the last couple of years, was essentially a final recognition that actually you're going to have to include workers in any kind of environmental upheaval, and it's going to have to include something that creates jobs for people who are displaced, creates jobs for people who are currently underemployed. I would stress that it needs to create union jobs specifically, because a lot of the industries that historically have been most easily unionized have been dirty, unsafe industrial unions, right? The Labor Party, which existed in the 1990s for a brief period, had a lot of support from oil and gas workers of all people, and the reason for that is because these are people who are putting their life on the line essentially to run our society, and so this idea that you're just going to cast these people aside. I think a very liberal approach that I've heard from people in the past is, well, it doesn't matter if they lose their jobs because the good of everyone is more important. Well, in some sense, I guess that's true, but you're never going to build a movement for the good of everyone if you cast away people individually here and there, because eventually the people you've thrown away add up to too many people. That you're not gonna build a mass movement around anything at that point. And so I think I'm very hopeful around the idea that we can merge the environmental movement and the labor movement around this concept of a Green New Deal that understands that economic issues and environmental issues and labor issues are all desperately intertwined. You think about the miners last year in Harlan who, their coal company closed, and so they blocked a railroad track until they got their pay. Yeah. Those kind of sites of class struggle. Do you think the people who were blocking that railroad track wanted to see the mountains destroyed and wanted to not have water that they could drink? Of course not. They understand as much as anyone, probably more than anyone, the impact that carbon production has had on this country. But you have to have a plan for what happens to those people that empowers them and supports them.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on, and we are all out of time, but I really want to thank our panelists today. Talking about organized labor, you just heard from Nick Conder, Jo Smiley, and Katie Punsley. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, guys.
We encourage everybody to check out dsalouisville.org. They've got a public event coming up on Sunday, May 31st at 8 p.m., Democratic Socialism After Bernie. There'll be a great online conversation about that on the 31st at 8. You can learn more, find the link to register under events at dsalouisville.org. All right, stay tuned to Forward Radio. Lots of great stuff coming up, and we'll be back in your ears again in 1 week's time. Thanks, everybody.